Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade.
We chronicle the distinct memories of our childhood in our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s, which takes you on a notably historic journey through that often forgotten decade. We also want to hear about your experiences during the 1950s. We will feature guests whose special stories of that decade will bring to mind magical moments of reflection, some with tears, some with smiles, but above all, a good dose of laughter.
We would like you to chat with us as we bring to mind the sights and sounds so familiar to that time in history. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Hello, friends. Thank you for joining us again today. Jackie and I are always delighted to have new viewers and viewers who have watched our Fun Chats in the past be a part of our programming and learning about the history of that decade of the 1950s. And Jackie, we have another wonderful guest today. So why don't you take it away with the program?
Indeed. First of all, a couple of housekeeping items. Viewers, please look at the bottom where you see the purple banner. It says www.whilethewindmillwatched.com. It has much information about this program as well as the book, While the Windmill Watched. Now, speaking of the book, you look in the upper right-hand corner. Can you see that, Janine? The
Yes.
book?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, it is While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s. And our guest has his name on the back of that book because he was very kind to give us a pre-published endorsement. And you'll also notice on the right-hand corner, that little white dot, that is something that happened in a year after it was published. It won the National Independent Press Award for regional nonfiction in the category of region. And it was given the title of Distinguished Favorite. So we are really glad for that little book, to have that little award. So, as they used to say, on with the show. So, the guests of the 1950s Fun Chat, who were the guests, were either influenced by the decade or were born in the decade of the 1950s. And this guest was not born in the 50s, but was certainly influenced by it. His name is Doug Goehring, and he was born in 1965. He attended Bismarck State College and is a licensed medical laboratory technician. However, his lifelong interest has been the realm of agriculture. He's a third-generation farmer who, along with his son, Dustin, operates a 2,800-acre no-till farm near Menoken in south-central North Dakota, where a variety of crops have taken root. This energetic gentleman has been president or director of several state and national organizations within the realm of agriculture. Since 2009, he has held the title of North Dakota Agricultural Commissioner. So Commissioner Goehring and his wife Annette have 6 children and 11 grandchildren. Doug, we welcome you to the 1950s Fun Chat and look forward to hearing more about agriculture in North Dakota.
Yes.
Hi, ladies.
Hi.
Great to be on your program.
Thank you. We
I
appreciate
saw
you.
pictures of my grandfather, and there are several of them. So
Yes.
it takes me back a
He was a wonderful close friend of our father's.
Yes.
So let's begin by having you tell us about your farming heritage, and perhaps some of that has to do with your grandfather. And how did that influence you?
Well, I guess I've always enjoyed and loved the farm and rural living and the ag community we lived in. I will say I grew up believing that all communities were like our community. I came to find out later on that wasn't necessarily true, but I did very much love agriculture, being outside, being with livestock, and got my start early on. I think I got on the tractor and was planting when I was right around 10 years old, 11 years old.
Mhm.
And from that point on, not that I necessarily liked the freezing cold mornings and the hot afternoons, and your feet were about burning over the top of the transmission. But I just, there was a sense of worth and purpose and value that came with that, and it just kind of stuck with me. And in fact, when I was in high school, I had thought, "Yep, I'm going to farm the rest of my life. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a farmer."
Mhm. Mhm.
The good Lord had other things in store for me, and actually pretty broad path. I mean, between working construction, working as a hired man, in between there, and then going back to college, became a medical lab tech. Actually, found out that science and the everything around me had real value and purpose. Something I almost failed in high school, but excelled in afterwards because now I saw that there was purpose, there was meaning there, and it was very applicable. And between having some seed businesses, still staying connected with the farm and agriculture, and then moving into quite a few other realms, which had to do with policy development, working with the local farm bureau, and then serving on the state, and actually started serving on some national committees, boards, organizations. Continued to do that type of stuff, and at some point, actually became president of our state's largest domestic insurance company, and
Mhm.
that was a very strange way in which that all happened. But I thought it was this really strange animal that was hard to comprehend. So it kind of fascinated me, and did that. And that just continued to throw more doors open. And at some point, I had officials at the in state government that asked me to run for agriculture commissioner. It's an elected position. It's a constitutional office. They said, you know business, you know agriculture, and you should really seriously, strongly consider it. And they kept twisting, and pretty soon I threw my hat in the ring, and uh, didn't win right away. Uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
but
But you had the experience of a campaign.
yeah, so had that, and ultimately there was the position was vacated. I was then asked by the governor to serve in that vacancy and run for the office. Did so, and was successful, and that was 14 years ago. And I'd like to say I've loved every day. I think up until COVID, I only had one bad day all those years. I
How wonderful.
absolutely loved it.
Good.
Doug, let's talk about, go back. You talked about having been in office for 14 years, and surely you've seen changes in North Dakota agriculture in that 14 years. But what about back in the 1950s? What was agriculture in the state of North Dakota like back then?
So we were pretty much a small grain state. When you looked across our state, you probably saw a lot of wheat fields, very little corn production. There was some corn production because we had livestock.
Sure.
We saw a lot more oats and barley, millet. Uh, you had various crops throughout the state, but only in the Red River Valley did you find any of the uh, other specialty crops. But even then, when you looked across the state, small grain production, durum, hard red spring wheat,
Mhm.
and oats, barley, most of those crops. And then you had a lot of the feed crops that were being produced just for livestock production. But and that was the other thing. You found extensive livestock operations across the state.
Mhm. Mhm.
Very much small, but they existed.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so, of course, how agriculture changed in that respect, the type of crops that were grown to more row crops, would you say? Corn, beans, then of course the marketing of those products and the processors and the elevators had to change in conjunction with that. Was that difficult for the state to make that change?
It's probably more difficult for processors and service providers to actually transition with egg producers. Egg producers are innovative by nature, probably some of the most trusting and motivated individuals. And a lot of it comes down to you got debt to service and a family to raise. So quite frankly, you're looking for opportunities. One thing I'll say that I forgot to mention back then is flax. At statehood, we produced a lot of flax. Every time you had a new breaking, it's like flax went into that new breaking there, and it was a part of our heritage, and it certainly propelled us forward. I think what was interesting is by the time we hit the 80s, people were already looking for something different. They knew that after we went through the 70s, we had the embargo that was in place, the Russian grain embargo, that we couldn't pay our bills anymore with just a wheat crop. And people were looking, they were motivated to find something else. The 80s came along, we had drought, and we pretty much saw that across the Midwest. And it was severe, it was harmful. Our farming practices were of such that it was the same farming practices we had in place for the last 100 and 200 years. And we started to look at ways in which we could implement more conservation into the system. So in North Dakota, which was one of the leaders in no-till or conservation tillage, you had Manitoba, Minnesota, and North Dakota that were leaders in that. And a lot of that equipment was being developed in North Dakota, in this region, that helped propel us and move us forward. Much like the four-wheel drive tractor. A lot of people don't know that the four-wheel drive tractor that you see globally now was first made in North Dakota by the Steiger family. And it just took off from there. Same way with no-till equipment. Now, John Deere and Case and other companies came along, Burgo, and to try and do more with that, to commercialize it. But a lot of the fabrication, a lot of the modifications still started on the farm. They still started with farmers that would be out in the field and say, yeah, but this isn't working right. That information was being shared with John Deere, Case, and the other companies so that they could continue to perfect it over the 80s and the 90s and give us what we have today. I think there's still some input, but yeah, that's what we're farming with. Now we have 54 different commodities we produce commercially in North Dakota. We're number one in the production of about 10, 12, depends on the year. But we've incorporated things such as out of those 54 commodities, in the top 10 would be durum, hard red spring wheat. We still have those. Every once in a while, we fall on the barley production, 1, 2, or 3rd in the nation. Flax, canola, sunflower production, we're number one in. Peas and lentils, we go back and forth with Montana on that. We also dry bean production. When you look at navies and pinto beans, we're number one in those. But dry bean production in the United States, North Dakota is by far the leading producer of dry beans in the United States.
Amazing.
We produce about 38% of all the dry beans in the nation. And that would include the kidney beans, the dark reds, the light red beans, black beans, all those. So we've propelled there. Plus honey production. We're number one in the nation for honey production. And in fact, if number 2 were to double their production, we'd still be number 1. So
and who's number 2?
I believe South Dakota has now moved into number 2.
Okay.
A few years ago,
right.
we moved up out of 4th.
I recently read
Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. That North Dakota is a hotbed for emerging crops, and you mentioned a few: hemp, hops, fava beans, and tell me if I'm pronouncing this right. Something called carinata, or is that spelled right? Or right?
Yeah.
It is Ethiopian. Okay, and it's there because it has a high oil content and makes it suitable for biofuels such as jet fuel. So, is there anything being produced at this time that you know of?
There might be a little bit of production. The biggest problem that they've had to contend with is yield. And
Mm-hmm.
when you don't have very good yield, you can actually not be very competitive in the marketplace for
Okay.
oil crops. So our major oil crops really come down to, and the one thing I should have stated too, not only do we produce all those other crops, we're significant producers of corn, soybeans, sugar beets, and potatoes in North Dakota. In fact, on sugar beets and potatoes, we're ranked number 2 and 3, respectively. So that's right there. But when you look at our oil crops, it's soybeans, sunflowers, and canola. Canola is a fantastic oil, but it's generally in the vegetable oil market, which puts it food grade, and it generally demands or commands more dollars per pound on that. So it doesn't always compete well for industrial use. Where at least when you look at some corn oil, you look at soybean oil and sunflower oil, they fit in there a little bit better and can compete in the biofuels market a little bit easier.
So, Doug, with all that great production of crops that North Dakota has, it certainly has led, I would think, to an export system and a more global market for those crops in North Dakota. And if so, how does this global marketing compare today to back in the 50s? Was there such a thing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And here's what kind of happened is we'd always relied on I'll call them the big four, the ABCs, the ADMs, the Cargills, the Bungies, to do most of our marketing because it went down a pit, went in an elevator, was commingled with other products, and marketed in that form or fashion. Generally would end up on some ship in some big Panamax and would be delivered to some country where they would offload it and it'd be dispersed. What's happened since then is North Dakota started getting the business of marketing themselves. And going back to, we're all innovative, but North Dakota, I believe, has been very innovative in trying to market itself. We are smack dab in the geographical center of the North American continent. Excuse me. And the one thing I noticed, because I was involved at the national level in international marketing and with USB, the United Soybean Board, and I had noticed when I was traveling abroad and we were working on trade missions, that I would come across products like some of our peas and dry beans, and they would find out from, or I would find out that they're suppliers, buyers of these products, and I'd say, well, that's strange. Where'd you get those from? And they would say, Arizona. And I was like, Arizona doesn't produce any of that stuff. I'd read their package, do a little digging, and find out that there was buyers in the United States that were purchasing products from North Dakota. They were cleaning and processing them, packaging them, and selling them. And then everybody thought Arizona was a huge producer or some other was a huge producer of these, and they actually didn't produce them. So it was an opportunity to really visit with our own companies up here and help support their efforts to become food exporters in North Dakota. Now we have 60 food export companies. We have a hub, an intermodal system in Minot, North Dakota, where they do a lot of IP, or what you'd call identity preservation shipments out of there into markets for smaller buyers. But not just that, they can also do some larger uh, product shipments. But now North Dakota is establishing itself and has a footprint globally with 139 different countries. That is unbelievable. It is amazing. And we are shipping all kinds of products, some specialty wheats, some durum. We're doing a lot of peas and lentils. We're doing chickpeas, a lot of dry bean production into Central America, South America, but also into Asia, Southeast Asia, and even conversations have ensued about doing some more of that, potentially into Europe. Although it's a different route it has to go, we're not quite as competitive, but we're very competitive out of the northwestern part of the United States and into the Asian, Southeast Asia, and Central Americas and the South American markets.
So how do these products get to the ports? Do they go by train, like to Seattle, or by truck, or what?
Good question. So most everything that's going in the Pacific Northwest, the majority of it is going to be by rail, and that's where the intermodal system and the containers. The rest of our bulk shipments, most definitely. Traditionally, they used to always go east. Now they are going west and into those regions where they're offloaded, transloaded, and go on different ships, depending if it's container or if it's bulk going into Panamaxes. When you look at North Dakota, the breakdown of how product is moved, though, about 17% is moved on rail or on rubber, on truck, and 83% is moved on rail. So we're very dependent on rail service and having a good system in place. And that can be a little challenging during the winter sometimes when you have a lot of snow or extremely cold weather. Extremely cold weather doesn't mean that trains stop, but they do shorten up. They have cold air pressure to maintain brakes, or at least the ability to move those trains, because when they lose air pressure, the brakes slam shut and you don't move them. So they go from 7,200 feet down to 3,900 feet, which means now you need more crews, more trains, more locomotives, and it really limits velocity and capacity on the rail system. But
Doug, how did last winter in North Dakota affect all this?
it did. It caused some problems in some areas, and this time it wasn't necessarily because of the cold weather. It was because we had substantial snow. It wasn't record breaking. I think we made about I think it was fourth in our record for snowfall, but it started early and stayed late. I mean, we got snow in October, early November, and it didn't actually melt in our fields this year, the snowbanks, until May. I have pictures of snowbanks still in the field at the beginning of May, and by then we'd already had a crop planted.
Yes.
We'd be moving into corn planting, in some cases maybe even wrapping that up and then moving into soybeans, sunflowers, and other. So this last winter had some challenges across the state, and there was some disruption in services. I know Cargill has a large corn plant and corn syrup in southeastern North Dakota. They really were impacted dramatically, and it hurt them bad. We're hoping to get that resolved going forward, working with the railroads.
Do you see then the detaining of being able to get in and planting a crop? Do you see that as being an indicator of a short crop this year, or is it going to just catch right back up?
It all depends. Some will tell you, yeah, you hurt your ability to have, your potential yield achieved. But
Mhm.
most of that all comes down, it's a timing issue when you're pollinating a crop. If you look at how crops develop and grow at pollination, they're going to need the most amount of water. Well,
Yes.
the earlier you can do that, like towards June, early July, that's generally when most of our rains have come because we start to dry up, uh, mid-July through August. You start to get into harvest season, and it's not a good time to be flowering your crop then. And what's happened when you have later planting, you have crop development and pollination taking place later in the season when it's drier. So historically, traditionally, when you have that, you're going to have less yield. And this year, um, it's been sporadic how rain has come across the area. So it's a wait and see. Plus, heat is another factor. If you have a lot of heat when you're pollinating, whether it's small grains, whether it's corn, sunflowers, that can be disruptive to yield. And you generally want cooler temperatures and moisture so that your crop can hit its full potential.
Doug, have you, in going back to the exporting part, have you ever taken a crop and followed it from planting to harvest to processing to shipping?
I haven't personally, but we have companies that do. And that's when I got into the identity preserved. That is tracked. So it goes to a specific buyer, but they know if they're not planting it themselves or they've worked with and contracted with farmers in the area or the region, they have a good idea. First of all, it's variety specific. Secondly, they also have records, or at least can attain those records, of when that crop was planted, how it was managed, and when it was shipped, processed, and when it was packaged, and then ended up in a container that went to a very specific destination.
That sounds like a Prairie Public TV special right there. From seed to
Yeah.
just from seed to sea, over the sea.
Yes, export, yes. Hey, Doug, tell us about if you have one, a typical day as your responsibility as Commissioner of North Dakota Agriculture.
Well, I would probably surprise a lot of people because first thing everybody thinks, well, it's all about dealing with farmers every day. And the reality is, because I'm a constitutional office and our forefathers gave certain duties to the Ag Commissioner, only about 40%, maybe 45% of my portfolio is food and agriculture. The rest is tied into like the Industrial Commission. There's other duties such as Water Commission, so water appropriations, flood, all that stuff fits in there. Infrastructure, business development, trade, that's all in my portfolio. Tax equalization is in that portfolio, so I have tax equalization. We serve on the board, the governor and I, along with the treasurer, the auditor, and the tax commissioner. We do appeals and go through those things, and we can overrule political subs if they haven't been fair and how they've treated their constituents. But on the Industrial Commission, those duties entail 6 different research committees that we oversee. That can be renewable, clean, sustainable, lignite, oil and gas. We have various responsibilities there. We also have bonding for the state, housing for the state, banking with the Bank of North Dakota, which is unique because it's the only one in the country. We also have state mill and elevator, which is now the largest mill and elevator, not just in the United States, not just in North America, but in the Western Hemisphere.
My goodness.
It has
really grown.
been substantial. We're doing wonderful things with that. So this whole system is wonderful.
is Dakota made flour then still the name of that flour milled there?
It is.
Okay.
It is.
Mill and elevator.
Yeah. So do you happen to know when this began, the mill and elevator?
I think we just celebrated our 100th last year. Was it our 100th? Yeah.
Okay.
It was 100 years that the mill and elevator's been set up. Keep in mind that we're a very prairie populous state, as some would define us. And with that, we felt we weren't getting a good deal from the grain trade. And quite frankly, between Minneapolis and Chicago, it always seemed as though they wanted to buy it for as cheap as they possibly could and break the poor farmer. Or with respect to banking, you couldn't get a loan unless it was really high interest rates because they thought we were, just too risky out here in the prairie to be farming and ranching. So we developed and created our own mill and elevator, and we also created our own bank. And we've had to, over a period of time, develop those into entities that supported our economy, didn't necessarily compete with the private sector, especially in the bank side of it. The bank is set up to support our local banks and bring programs to industry, whether it's Main Street, whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, or the oil and gas industry, be available to support those efforts and support our economy. And then with the state mill, that's a little different. We do compete in the private sector, but we establish a better price and a higher quality product that then ends up being on the shelf for people to access.
Mom's favorite flour was Dakota made flour. She made loaves and loaves and loaves of bread. And I bet your grandma Goehring was the same way.
Yep. My grandparents that was sustenance. That's exactly what you did is you bought as much local as you possibly can. And to that point, we still do. We're still buying crystal sugar because we have sugar beet plants in the state, and buying our flour and any other products from the mill and elevator and Dakota Made. So yes, it's wonderful.
I see your face brighten anytime we talk about your grandpa or grandma Goehring. What was your relationship with them like? Of course, this was after the 50s, but in the 60s.
Yeah.
Did you know your grandma Goehring?
No, she passed away just before I was born.
Yeah. Judy was in high school then, I think.
Pardon me?
I think your Aunt Judy was in high school when that happened.
Yes.
And,
Yep. So I never got to know Grandma Goehring, but and I never called him Grandpa Goehring. I actually call him Grandpa Howard.
Okay.
I don't know why. I always, from the day I remember, that was Grandpa Howard. I think it's because I heard, as you're growing up, you hear people say Howard.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, that's my grandpa. So that's Grandpa Howard. And, used to go to the elevator with him, and he'd buy me a pop, and I had to sit there and behave and watch. And I'd go out. I had to be careful if I walked out there where, because he was dumping trucks and weighing trucks and doing scale tickets. I could go out there and stand, but it had to be in the back. Stay away. And
right, very.
Well, did they still have that little catwalk that connected the office to the elevator?
Yes.
Okay.
There was that little catwalk, which I think the first time I ever walked out there, I looked through the slits in the board, and I'm like, holy cow, I don't want to fall through there.
No.
We weren't very rational back then.
Yeah, it's likely that you met our father as well.
Oh, yes.
Jack and Howard were just like this.
They were dear friends. I knew Jack very well, and he was a great man.
So we've gone back to Menoken, the town of Menoken, in the time of the 50s, in that era. And I know, and when you gave an endorsement to our book, you mentioned about that time in America, when small farming communities were different than they are now. How are they different, Doug?
you saw back then your community was different. The way you interacted, and we still held part of that actually going into the 70s,
Mhm.
but it did start to dissolve and fracture, and people got busier.
Mhm.
Um, Farms grew. You couldn't, and part of that I'll say, and I think this is the confusion when people say, all these big farms out here, I just don't understand why they keep getting bigger. Well, part of it was back in the early 70s, and I think it was right around 74. I had looked some of these stats up. For about 4,700 or $5,400, you could raise a family,
Mm. Mm.
a family of four. By the time we were in the 80s, we were already up to $12,000.
Mm.
And when you got into the 90s, we were already $37,000 to raise a family of four. The pressures that were put on families meant, and since we weren't getting paid any more for a bushel of wheat or for a pound of beef or a pound of pork, um, you had to do more, and you had to manage differently. And pretty soon, I remember raising hogs, and you made $6 when I was young. I made $6 in every one of my little weanlings that I sold.
Hmm.
Well,
Wow.
um, that was probably good money back in the mid 70s. But
Hmm.
later on, when I got into the late 80s and early 90s, and I wanted to get back into pig production, you were still only making $6 on every one of those little pigs.
Mhm.
Hmm. Yes.
So with that, I mean, you had to raise more little pigs. And when it came to the farm, um, and you were farming that land, it's not that our yields went up. Our yields were, you know, 20 bushel an acre back in the early 70s. We're only at 20,
Mm.
26, 28 bushels an acre by the early 90s when I took over the farm. So you had to farm more acres just to service your debt and meet your family obligations. So you saw farms getting bigger. So with respect to that, and it kind of circles back to that's where you've seen this migration and this change in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, that all of a sudden it forced us and propelled us into the modern era of agriculture, because not all the boys could stay home and farm anymore. You couldn't support
Sure.
those families.
Mhm.
And so you had to automate more. You had to get bigger equipment to cover more acres and to get it done, because you're probably going to do it by yourself or with one other person if you're an average size farm.
Is that about the era that more farm women started to find employment away from the farm?
Yes, spot on. And it was to pull in some off farm income to help meet some of those family living issues. And then at a later date, by the time we got into the late 90s, just the cost of healthcare. Now you had women going off the farm just to get health insurance and to earn
Hmm.
some money to help the farm survive. So it's been daunting and it's been challenging, and we saw that. So then it changed your community, how you interacted, what you did. We
Hmm.
used to have, and I remember seeing um, grandpa and dad would talk about, you had community events
Mm-hmm.
where
Hmm.
people got together, and it'd be half day events or all day events. And it's like, my God, if you can pull 2 hours out of your schedule now, you're lucky to go
Yeah.
do something in your community. But
Yes.
you saw that, and you saw the interaction in you went and helped out. I remember uh, we always had neighbors and people that you were either going there and helping them or they were coming over and helping. And we just don't have that as much anymore. It's a concerted effort now, a very conscious effort if you're going to do something like that.
Yes. Yes.
So those things have changed. I
Hmm.
believe we've lost that. I love the 50s, the music, the time, the People say it was much simpler. Um, there weren't as many things to distract you,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
but there was that social aspect. You built stronger, better relationships, I felt. Um, that's not to take away from what we have now, but I've said that I was probably born too late. I don't know if I'm an old soul, but I look at some of that period of time, and you're like, oh, man, it'd be so good not to have this pulling you away or this doing that. And oh, yeah. I was in 4-H and I loved it when we did that. But I look
Uh-huh.
back over those and I hear people talk about, you know, in the early 70s and the 60s, what 4-H was like. And
Mhm.
you kind of like, yeah, that'd be fun. That'd be great.
It
Yeah.
was.
Yes, very much so. Doug, we're nearing the end of our broadcast. This has been wonderful, so informative, and it's great to connect with you again. But can you recall one fun memory from back in those days, and 50s, 60s time that really has affected you?
I loved our community picnics. Oh, um, it was, there was something, I suppose you could say, a bit romantic about it. But it's when you got a chance, because most of the time everybody was working hard. I generally knew a lot of men in the community, but unless you were in for lunch at a specific time, you would meet some of the women. But it was during the picnics where I really got a chance to know who cooked what and what recipes I really liked. And then I would ask, do you think we can get that recipe? I had to watch how you said that because it was like, you don't appreciate what I do.
Oh,
So
to have Maureen Kershaw's chocolate cake with chocolate frosting, or Eudora Pfeiffer's potato salad, or Grandma Gladys Goehring's. She made these wonderful date ball cookies, and the recipe's in our
I
book.
heard about those. Yeah.
And there was Zella Trogger made the best barbecue sauce. It was on and on. I know what we know what you're saying, Doug. Yeah.
Yeah. And no, there was just something so special about it. And it was the time that you spent with people and you really got to see them not in a working environment, but now in a social environment.
Mhm.
And it helped you establish and understand how you need to interact with people, how you appreciate people, what you need to do. I had said it earlier that we grew up in a community that was so giving. We weren't out competing with each other to rent land away or do things like that. I found out later in life that there were communities like that. And it took me a while to understand that because we grew up in a community that was different. And I, I still struggle with that to today because that's still instilled in me. We don't need to have everything and we don't need to compete against others to just work through this. And the good Lord will open doors and create opportunities and you don't have to do it at the expense of somebody else. But that
Exactly.
was my upbringing and that was my community. And we all seem to appreciate each other. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, it,
It
I
was it was
that fun.
interesting when we were still in prior to writing the book. We talked with some of the women who were living in the community at the time we grew up there in the 50s, and one lady had said, "This is basically wonderful words that she contributed to the book," and we quote her in it, and she said, "No one ever thought in our community that they were better than the other person."
Mhm.
And what a wonderful feeling.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
That.
that's absolutely right. We had people that had more than us.
Mhm.
There were some that
Mhm.
had less than us,
Mhm.
You actually had compassion on them. They probably gave us a softer heart.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And you were friends with everybody. It didn't matter what
Didn't
your
matter. No.
socioeconomic status was.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that
Mhm.
that never even crossed our mind. Didn't
Mhm.
care. Didn't matter. It didn't matter what your heritage was, but everybody was there as Americans anyways. So no one
Mhm.
was professing to be something.
And that picnic was kind of an equalizer.
Yes.
So what are you talking about the Minokan school picnic or the 4-H picnic?
Every once in a while you'd have the Milken School picnic, you'd have a community picnic every once in a while. They would
4-H
get
picnic.
together, do a 4-H picnic
Yes.
down at the Grove,
Yep.
and
Mhm.
what a wonderful place to hang out and really be kids. The other thing I remember, and I think about it now from time to time, and I still struggle with it. Um, there was an order when you ate. There was protocols that were in place. The men went first, and the women, and then the children. Nowadays, I see the kids think they should need to be first. They had the least to contribute, but oh my God, they're the first in line taking all the food. And then by the time the adults get there, it's like, hey, Martha, where's your potato salad? All it was there.
Yes. Yes.
It was there, past tense. Wow.
Doug, thank you. Thank you very much for being our guest today on the 1950s Fun Chat. And viewers, we're so thankful that you have had an opportunity to hear Doug's story about North Dakota agriculture and about him as a gentleman who leads the state of North Dakota in the area of agriculture.
Mhm.
Jackie, can you conclude our program for us?
Just a couple of things, and that is, viewers, let's check your colors. You know where the blue thumbs up button is. Please hit on that. And the red subscribe button, please hit that. And then until next time, we encourage you to involve your friends and tell your relatives even about the 1950s Fun Chat.
Yes.
Until then,